She looked like a CEO. She was a CEO. But they still told her she didn't belong there. Celeste Monroe had managed billions, sat across from prime ministers, built a fund that redefined ESG investing in America. And yet, on a Tuesday morning in Santa Monica, she stood in a marble lobby while a 20-something receptionist looked her up and down and said, "Sorry, ma'am. This location is for legacy tier clients only. We don't take walk-ins." Have you ever been turned away, not because of who you are, but because of what they saw? Tell us where you're watching from, and wait till you see what she did next. "Legacy tier," Celeste repeated, her tone calm, almost amused. The receptionist straightened. "Yes, clients must be referred through private channels." Celeste gave a slight nod. "Understood. Let me speak to your branch manager." The young man blinked, clearly unsure. "I'll see if he's available." She took a seat, waited, watched. Two white men in golf polos walked in 5 minutes later, laughing, loud, sunburned from wherever they'd just come from. They barely paused before being waved in, greeted by name. Celeste was still sitting there when security approached. He kept it polite. "Ma'am, we're gonna have to ask you to come back with an appointment. You understand, it's just protocol." She stood, no raised voice, no anger, just a silence that cracked like ice. "I understand," she said. "Thank you." She stepped out of the bank and into the California sunlight. Her driver opened the door. "Ma'am?" he asked. She didn't answer at first, just stared ahead, eyes sharp, calculating. Then, in a voice soft but steady, "Get me online. I need access to the grid." 10 minutes later, in her San Francisco office, Celeste logged into the core control panel of the Ethos Core Federal Grid. She didn't make a call, didn't type a word, didn't warn anyone. She just clicked one button, red flag, Tier 1 protocol, initiate. And somewhere, far from the polished walls of that Santa Monica branch, $3.4 billion in institutional assets locked down. They hadn't even learned her name, but she was already erasing theirs from the system. The moment Dr. Celeste Monroe tapped Red Flag Tier 1 protocol, a quiet chain reaction ignited behind the scenes of America's financial grid. No alarms, no red lights, just data, rerouting, freezing, re-ranking. Within 60 seconds, 47 partner institutions received automated alerts. Ethics Compliance Rating Downgrade. Source: Verdant Trust Compliance Authority. 3 hedge funds paused trades. 2 global ESG platforms flagged Highmark Bank as non-compliant. $3.4 billion in capital, stuck mid-transaction. No approvals, no liquidity. Back in Santa Monica, the branch manager still hadn't come out of his office. He didn't know his clearance level had been temporarily suspended. One of the junior bankers stared at her screen, confused. "Hey, the Highmark Caspian fund routing just failed. Twice." The guy next to her frowned. "Mine too. Is the server down?" Meanwhile, in a glass tower in New York, board member number 3 of Highmark Holdings got a call he wasn't expecting. "Why did Verdant drop us from their approved ledger?" he stammered. "Verdant? They wouldn't do that without... Wait, is this public?" "It will be in 5 minutes." Celeste didn't flinch as the system lit up on her screen. She wasn't angry. She was focused. This wasn't just punishment for a branch's mistake. This was a reminder of the quiet power built over decades by women like her mother who were turned away 1,000 times before the doors ever opened. "They won't fix what they refuse to feel," her mother used to say. So now, she would make them feel it. Not by shouting, but by freezing everything they thought couldn't be touched. At 9:42 a.m., Highmark Bank's Manhattan HQ called an emergency meeting. By then, $3.4 billion in capital had already been locked across 6 investment flows. News outlets hadn't picked it up yet, but the internal chaos was boiling. The compliance director looked pale. "This isn't just a systems error. It's Ethos Core. That means someone flagged us at the federal level." The room went silent. The CEO leaned forward. "Who?" One intern in the corner, quiet until now, cleared his throat. Verdant Trust just listed us as Red Flag Tier 1, and the executive who triggered it is Dr. Celeste Monroe. That name hit like a lightning bolt. In another city, on a different coast, Celeste sat in her office, surrounded by quiet. Her phone buzzed, but she didn't answer. She was reading something else. A dusty folder marked Monroe Legacy Accord sat open beside her. It had been drafted by her mother 20 years earlier, proposing real-time ethics audits for all federally backed banks. It was rejected back then. Too bold, too inconvenient. But Celeste didn't forget. And now, she wasn't proposing anything. She was executing. Across the boardrooms, panic spread. "We have to fix this. Call her, apologize, offer to meet." But Celeste didn't want meetings. She wanted the system to feel what silence felt like. Not one CEO had spoken up when her mother's proposals were dismissed. Not one man in that Santa Monica branch looked twice before ignoring her. Now they all wanted to talk. Too late. She stared at the dashboard. Ethics rankings were recalculating. 4 CEOs had already received pressure from ESG investors. They didn't know it yet, but they were all about to resign. Dr. Celeste Monroe didn't expect an apology. She knew how these things worked. When a powerful black woman exposes the cracks in the system, the response isn't remorse. It's deflection, delay, damage control. So when 3 board members of Highmark Holdings called within an hour, leaving frantic voicemails, Celeste didn't pick up. She was already 5 steps ahead. She stood in her private office, sunlight streaming through the windows. On the wall behind her hung a black and white photo of her mother, Lydia Monroe, speaking at a protest in 1983, hand raised, eyes burning with hope. Beneath that photo was a plaque etched with a phrase Lydia repeated for decades. "They won't remember your silence, but they'll never forget your refusal." Celeste ran her hand over the photo frame. Then she turned to her screen. The Monroe Legacy Accord, her mother's life's work, was now active in beta form inside Ethos Core, a digital ethics rating protocol for every federally insured financial institution, the same system that had just flagged Highmark. But Celeste wasn't done. She clicked into a new dashboard, Ethos Cascade, a long-classified pilot system originally built for private ethics monitoring. She recoded the thresholds, linked them to real-time compliance data, and with one final biometric confirmation, she made it live. At that exact moment, 4 major financial institutions across the U.S. saw something they'd never seen before. Ethics violation detected. Access to public funding and ESG-aligned capital suspended pending review. The dominoes started falling. By sunset, 4 CEOs, each sitting atop massive banks with histories of discrimination complaints, had received ultimatums from their boards. 3 resigned quietly. 1 fought it, then caved when the press got wind of what was coming. Meanwhile, news of the freeze made its way to social media. A quiet whisper turned into a trending wave. Hat Red Flag Protocol, hat Monroe Accord. Not just a bank. Someone posted a clip of Celeste speaking at a college event 2 years ago. "We don't dismantle bias by asking for better treatment. We dismantle it by rewiring the systems that decide who gets seen and who gets erased." By evening, millions had viewed it. At 9:07 p.m., Celeste stepped out onto her balcony overlooking the city. She sipped a glass of still water. Not champagne, not whiskey, still water. She wasn't celebrating, she was processing. Because this wasn't revenge, it was resolution. Not just for her, for the hundreds of women like her mother who had been turned away, dismissed, ignored. For every time someone said, "You don't belong here," without ever saying the words. She had answered without raising her voice. She had spoken through data, through systems, through silence. And now the industry was listening, because it had no choice. The next morning, the damage wasn't just real. It was measurable. Across 4 of the country's most powerful financial institutions, crisis teams scrambled. Spreadsheets turned red. Investor calls were missed. And in every group chat between compliance officers, one name kept surfacing. Who activated Ethos Cascade? No one had a straight answer. Because the woman who did it, Dr. Celeste Monroe, didn't announce her move. She executed it like a surgeon, precise, silent, and irreversible. At Verdant Trust headquarters, Celeste watched the ripple effect unfold. She wasn't smug, but she wasn't apologetic either, because the system was finally doing what it was designed to do: hold people accountable. And not just the frontline staff, but those at the top who allowed bias to become policy. She turned to her team and said quietly, "Start the audits. We're activating the full review chain, 42 institutions." Her voice was calm, but every auditor in the room knew this was historic. Meanwhile, the Santa Monica branch manager, yes, the one who never stepped out to greet her, finally got a call, not from his regional supervisor, but from the Office of Federal Ethics and Banking Compliance. "You're being investigated under the Monroe Accord mandate. Full internal records will be requested. Please prepare for federal review." He froze. He remembered her now. The woman in the blue suit. The one who didn't yell, didn't argue, just left. He'd thought she was no one. Now his entire career was on the line, because he didn't treat her like someone. Elsewhere, across law schools and economic think tanks, professors rewrote curriculum notes. The Monroe Legacy Accord was no longer theory. It was precedent. At a press conference in D.C., a senator aligned with the Banking Ethics Caucus addressed the media. "Dr. Celeste Monroe has done what regulators failed to do for years. She held power accountable, with a protocol built from truth, data, and generational courage. And now, we must follow through with legislation." And just like that, what started in a quiet bank lobby became a national reckoning. That evening, Celeste returned home. Her phone buzzed with messages, offers, requests for interviews. She ignored them all. Instead, she sat in her kitchen, sipping tea, while her niece, barely 10 years old, flipped through an ethics workbook from school. The little girl looked up and asked, "Auntie C, what's a legacy?" Celeste smiled gently. "A legacy," she said, "is what happens when people try to erase you, and instead, you write the next rule book." Outside, the headlines kept spinning. Inside, a revolution had already begun. The call came at 11:06 a.m. Not from a board member, not from an attorney, but from the new CEO of Highmark Holdings, a woman named Valerie Chen, freshly appointed just 2 hours earlier. "Dr. Monroe," she began, "I wanted to personally acknowledge the harm done to you and the system that allowed it." Celeste didn't interrupt. She let her finish. "This isn't a PR fix. I've read the Monroe Accord front to back, and I believe it's time we align our practices with the values we only talk about." Celeste was silent for a moment. Then she said calmly, "Your predecessor had 28 years and never picked up the phone." Valerie didn't flinch. "Then maybe this should have been my job all along." They didn't talk about settlements, didn't talk about restoring reputations. They talked about data access, policy change, and making anti-bias enforcement mandatory, not optional. By the end of the call, Celeste had given conditional approval to grant Highmark access to a Monroe Accord alignment pilot, a tool that would reshape internal compliance from the inside out. It wasn't forgiveness. It was structure, a roadmap toward change, not because they deserved it, but because the next generation did. Later that day, Celeste stood in front of her mother's old community bank, now just a historical marker in a gentrified district. She traced the carved brass plaque on the wall. Lydia Monroe, 1954 to 2011, advocate, mother, architect of unfinished systems. Celeste whispered under her breath, "We're finishing them now." And with that, she turned, walked away, and didn't look back. 2 weeks later, the financial world wasn't just watching, it was scrambling. Ethics violations, once quietly buried under HR reports or sensitivity training, were now showing up in bold red banners on compliance dashboards. And at the center of this seismic shift was one name, the Monroe Accord. Inside the U.S. Treasury Building, Top officials and industry leaders gathered in a closed-door ethics summit. The vibe wasn't cordial. It was cautious. Everyone was waiting for Celeste Monroe to arrive. When she did, she didn't walk in with a PR team or a lawyer or even an assistant. She walked in alone. A quiet room turned quieter. She took her seat, opened a folder, looked up. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because for too long, you built systems that only worked for people who looked like you. And when they didn't work for people like me, there was no process, just silence." A bank executive shifted uncomfortably. A senator cleared his throat. No one interrupted. Then came the proposal. Celeste introduced the Monroe Accord Federal Alignment Protocol, a standardized set of ethics compliance benchmarks that every federally backed financial institution must adopt to maintain ESG capital access, treasury partnerships, and public operational status. No more voluntary pledges. No more optics. Federal enforcement. Real teeth. And at the end of the document, 42 banks were listed. Each had to sign to retain access to over $700 billion in capital alignment partnerships. No signature? Funding pulled. System access revoked. Federal scrutiny guaranteed. They didn't all sign that day. But within 72 hours, after pressure from ESG funds, media, and internal whistleblowers, all 42 signed. Some tried to save face. Others tried to spin it as forward-thinking leadership. Celeste didn't care. This wasn't about headlines. This was about infrastructure. Back at Verdant Trust, Celeste stood before her leadership team. Some clapped. Others looked in disbelief. She just smiled faintly and said, "They used to say this was too ambitious, too radical, too black." A beat. Turns out, they were just too comfortable. Everyone in the room stood, because history had just shifted. And they weren't just witnessing it. They were part of it. A week after the Monroe Accord went into effect, it wasn't just financial institutions that felt the shift. It was classrooms. It was community centers. It was the street Celeste Monroe grew up on. And then, it hit the airwaves. NPR aired a special segment titled, "The Woman Who Rewired the System, Lydia and Celeste Monroe's Legacy." It opened with an old cassette recording, Lydia Monroe's voice crackling through static. "If they don't want to make room at the table, we'll build our own table, one where no one gets erased." Then the host explained how Lydia Monroe, a former civil rights accountant, had tried for decades to implement real-time ethics evaluations for banks after watching too many black and brown families get denied not because of numbers, but because of names. She was ignored, laughed off, eventually blacklisted. But her daughter built the damn system. Social media exploded. Chat Monroe Protocol began trending globally. Educators, youth leaders, even athletes reposted clips of Celeste testifying in front of the Ethics and Oversight Subcommittee. "You didn't break the law when you denied my mother a seat. You broke the system that was supposed to protect her." Back in her hometown of Newark, a mural of Lydia and Celeste appeared overnight. A mother and daughter standing back to back. One holding a ledger, the other holding a tablet. Across the top, in bold paint, "We remember who built the blueprint." People gathered beneath it, not for protest, but for planning. Local entrepreneurs met to learn about the Monroe Protocol. Banks began inviting ethics consultants trained under Verdant Trust. One community center even started a Young Ethics Architect Fellowship, named after Lydia. Celeste didn't seek the spotlight, but when Time requested a cover feature, she agreed, on one condition. "The story starts with my mother, not me." The journalist asked why. She answered simply, "Because I didn't rewrite the rules. I just had the tools to make them permanent." In the final week of the quarter, federal ethics compliance jumped 34%. 6 banks launched public audits of racial disparity cases. 3 announced reparative lending funds. But it wasn't just corporate cleanup. It was cultural memory. People weren't just fixing what went wrong, they were asking why it was allowed to go wrong in the first place. That night, Celeste walked through her old neighborhood. No bodyguards, no photographers. Just her and a quiet street. She passed a closed corner store where her mother used to hand out flyers about lending discrimination. Taped on the window now was a printed screenshot. A tweet with Celeste's quote, "This isn't revenge, this is correction." A teenage girl sitting on the curb recognized her. "Ms. Monroe, you really did all that just because they disrespected you at a bank?" Celeste paused, smiled. "No, I did all that because they disrespected every woman who ever walked in quietly and still got denied." The girl nodded, didn't say much, but something in her shifted. Like she just realized she didn't have to wait her turn to be heard, like maybe she could rewrite systems too. The U.S. Capitol building was unusually quiet that morning. Security was tighter, cameras were being checked and double-checked. Inside room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building, the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs prepared for a hearing that would ripple through history. The topic: Ethics Failures in Federal Banking, from Lydia Monroe to the Monroe Accord. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Dr. Celeste Monroe stepped into the chamber, not with a legal team, not with a tech demo, but with a leather-bound notebook that once belonged to her mother. The chairwoman opened. "Dr. Monroe, thank you for joining us. Your actions have, intentionally or not, sparked the most comprehensive ethics overhaul in modern banking. But today, we're here to ask, where do we go from here?" Celeste looked directly at her, then at the rest of the room. And for the first time in public, she said, "This was never about one bank or one disrespect. This was about the patterns that are invisible on paper but deeply felt in people's lives." She opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten records, collected by her mother over 22 years, documenting names, dates, branch numbers, and the subtle yet systemic ways Black families were denied, dismissed, or ignored. The room was silent. Then she added, "What you call data, we lived as damage." She then presented the Monroe Data Transparency Amendment, a bill that would require all federally backed banks to publish real-time demographic lending data quarterly, report internal bias audit outcomes annually, integrate ethics, benchmarking into executive compensation packages, establish a federally monitored grievance mechanism for ethics violations. No more vague apologies, no more "we'll do better" press releases. Real structure, real law, and for the first time, real consequences. One senator pushed back. "Isn't this overreach, Dr. Monroe? Punishing an entire industry for a few bad actors?" She didn't blink. If the few bad actors kept acting for 40 years with no interruption, they weren't bad actors. They were features of your system. The audience behind her erupted in quiet nods, and one woman in the back whispered, "Say that again." By the end of the hearing, 8 senators publicly endorsed the Monroe Amendment. 2 more requested time with her policy team. The Treasury Secretary, who had been silent for months, finally stepped forward and said, "It's time we start protecting people with the same force we protect capital." Later that afternoon, Celeste stood on the Capitol steps, notebook in hand, eyes squinting into the sun. A journalist asked, "Dr. Monroe, what's next?" She smiled. "We just put the truth into the congressional record. Now we make sure it becomes law." Then she walked down the steps, not as someone seeking power, but as someone setting precedent. It started with one bank visit, one refusal, one memory that had lived too long in silence. Now, months later, it ended with a signature. Not Celeste's, but the President of the United States, signing into law the Monroe Data Transparency and Ethics Enforcement Act, the first federal legislation of its kind requiring real-time ethics disclosures across every major U.S. financial institution. On live TV, with networks covering from both coasts, the president turned to Celeste. For too long, the burden of fairness fell on the shoulders of the wrong people. Today, that changes, because of you and your mother. Celeste didn't cry, not out of pride, but because she was thinking about how this law should have existed before Lydia Monroe ever walked into a branch and got told she didn't qualify. This wasn't a celebration. It was an overdue correction. A week later, she sat quietly in her mother's old office, now restored as a historical site and education center. On the wall hung Lydia's favorite quote, "You don't need power to demand dignity. You need memory." A teenage girl walked in with a tour group, then hung back. "You're Dr. Monroe, right? My teacher said you changed the law. That true?" Celeste smiled gently. "I didn't change the law. I helped it finally catch up." The girl nodded, thought for a second, then asked, "So what do we do now?" Celeste paused, closed Lydia's notebook for the last time. "Now, you learn how the system works, so next time you write it." Across the country, the impact rippled. 3 major banks launched internal ethics divisions, staffed by advocates instead of PR. 5 Ivy League law schools added Monroe Protocol to their core curriculum. Dozens of cities adopted the Lydia Fund, aimed at training young women in financial justice and leadership. And for the first time ever, the Federal Ethics Commission included a civilian advisory board, led by Verdant Trust. Celeste didn't return to the spotlight. She didn't need to. She'd already rewritten the blueprint, made sure the doors her mother built were now reinforced in law. And as the country moved forward, slowly, clumsily, but forward, it did so carrying her mother's voice, her name, and her legacy. Not erased, but embedded. Forever. Months had passed. The Monroe Act wasn't just a trending headline anymore. It was becoming muscle memory inside the industry. Bank executives no longer asked, "What will this look like on social media?" They asked, "What will this mean for our ethics score?" Inside a boardroom at Verdant Trust, a new cohort of young analysts gathered. They weren't just interns. They were the first class trained under the Lydia Monroe Ethics Leadership Program, a program co-funded by 17 ESG funds and 4 universities. Celeste sat at the back of the room, observing, listening. A young woman stood to present a model showing how smaller, community-based credit unions could integrate the Monroe Protocol into local lending without sacrificing profitability. She didn't just sound confident. She sounded free. After the session, one of the students approached Celeste quietly. "Dr. Monroe, I read about your mother. I think my grandmother might have been denied too. Back in '87, we never talked about it, but now we do." Celeste nodded. Sometimes change starts not with a new law, but with permission to tell the old truth. Meanwhile, nationwide stats rolled in. Ethics incident reporting was up 61%, not from increased violations, but because employees now had protection. $1.2 billion in reparative capital had been approved for previously redlined districts. Over 120 banks voluntarily added community advocates to their lending review boards, even before regulation required it. This wasn't fear compliance. This was culture shifting. And in the background of it all, Verdant Trust, under Celeste's leadership, quietly launched Ethos Core, a public dashboard ranking financial institutions by ethics, accessibility, and accountability. No ads, no lobbying, just transparency. And it became the most visited site in the industry within 3 months. But for Celeste, the real victory came in a small envelope. It arrived at her office. No return address. Inside, a photo. Her mother, Lydia, standing outside the First Colonial branch in Newark, holding up a sign that read, "Access without accountability is just performance." And behind her in the photo, a young Celeste, barely 5, holding Lydia's hand. Written on the back, in Lydia's handwriting, "One day they'll have to listen, not to me, but to you." Celeste closed her eyes and held the photo to her chest. She didn't need applause. She didn't need awards. She had proof. The silence that once erased her mother was now replaced by policy, public record, and permanent infrastructure. Legacy, after all, isn't a speech. It's a system that no one can quietly dismantle again. The camera panned slowly across the stage. A warm glow lit up the crowd gathered in Chicago's Civic Hall. CEOs, students, activists, economists, even 2 sitting senators. They weren't there for a gala. There was no champagne, no velvet rope. They were there for one reason: the launch of the Monroe Legacy Institute, a permanent center for ethics, economic justice, and leadership, named for Lydia and powered by Verdant Trust. Celeste stood at the podium. She didn't speak with drama. She didn't need to. She let the silence settle before saying, "The system didn't just miss my mother, it erased her. But now, her name sits on the building where future systems will be built." Behind her was a wall of names, people whose stories were documented, verified, and woven into the Monroe Protocol as case studies. No one erased. No one forgotten. And in the front row, sitting quietly, was that same teenage girl from Newark. The one who once asked Celeste, "You really did all that just because they disrespected you at a bank?" Now she was wearing a press badge, recording everything. Celeste ended her speech with a final thought. "We're taught to believe justice comes after something is broken, but I believe justice begins when someone refuses to look away." Then she stepped down, and in that moment, no protests, no outrage, no flash, just the steady building of something stronger than a headline. A new foundation, a new rule book, a future her mother always believed was possible. What do you think? Do you believe one person, with the right voice, memory, and power, can rewrite the system? Tell us in the comments, have you or someone you love ever been dismissed, overlooked, or shut out just because of who you are? And if you made it this far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, especially if stories like this matter to you. We've got more telltales coming. And trust us, you won't want to miss what's next.